Shalom, welcome to the Jewish View. My name is Rabbi Nachman Simon with the Chabad House of Delmar, and today we're going to talk about interesting stories, but not just fairy tales, but wonders and miracles by the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Here's his picture, and even though he passed away 1994, so it's a good few many years ago, but these are inspirational stories, and of course miracles still do happen. People could visit his gravesite, and thousands and tens of thousands of people do in Queens, New York, and ask for blessings, and these blessings do come and miracles do happen, but let's recount a few of them as they say here. When I went to visit the Rebbe on the 10th day of Shvat, the Hebrew day, a Jew from Afula sat next to me. This is said by Shimon Beckerman, a resident of Kfar Chabad, a city in Israel. He was a distinguished member of the Belz community, a Hasidic community, and a director of the nationwide Beis Malka school system for girls. After some hesitation, he asked, "From the look on your face, it seems to me that you are a Chabad, a Chassid of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Is this not so?" When I answered yes, he told me his story. A number of years ago, my infant child came down with a serious disease. The doctors recommended a very complicated operation. We were afraid to agree to the operation, but there did not seem to be any choice. A date was fixed in 2 weeks' time. A few days later, during Mincha, the afternoon service, a Chabad Chassid approached me and asked, "Why are you so upset?" When I could not succeed in getting him off my back, I told him about the situation. He immediately said that I must write the Rebbe. One never agrees to an operation without the Rebbe's blessing. I explained that the operation was scheduled for 2 weeks from now, and by the time I received a response, it would be too late. He was adamant. It is well known among Hasidim that when a letter is sent to the Rebbe, it arrives at its destination the moment it is sent. We did finally write the letter, and the unbelievable occurred. Less than a week after he wrote it, this itself was a wonder. Under normal circumstances, the letter would not even have arrived in New York by then. The answer arrived. The Rebbe blessed us with a refuah shlema, a complete and full recovery. At the end was a reminder about saying the daily portion of the Chumash, the Bible, the Hillel, some Psalms, and Tanya, the basic work of Chabad philosophy. The day of the operation arrived. We stood in front of the doorway to the operating rooms in an Amek Medical Center in Afula, reciting the Psalms, the Tehillim, and fearing the worst. Suddenly we saw a procession of doctors going in and out of the operating room. We could not hold back and asked what was going on. The doctors explained that just before the operation, the doctor in charge decided to take one final X-ray to determine exactly where to operate. To his utter amazement, the X-ray showed that there was nothing wrong. There was no need to operate. The doctor had called all his colleagues together to see this wonder, and that was the source of all the commotion. I told them that I knew exactly what was going on. I pulled out the Rebbe's letter and showed it to them. They answered, "You have a letter from the Rebbe in your hand? Why didn't you tell us? Now everything is clear." I did not become a Lubavitcher Chassid after experiencing such a clear wonder. I believe that every Jew needs to be connected to a Rebbe, and that connection is based on the source of his individual soul. But the daily class of the Torah studies, which the Rebbe wrote about at the end of his letter, that I continue to fulfill to this very day. It was an interesting miracle by the Rebbe, but we have so many more, so let's keep rolling. The car stopped right near the entrance. The secretary hurried to open the door, and out stepped the Lubavitcher Rebbe. A group of young Hasidim were silently standing by. The silence was broken only by the clicking of the photographer's camera. He stood in the middle of the path, taking advantage of every second to take another picture. Everyone knew the photographer, Reb Levi Yitzchak Frieden. The photographer continued snapping off shots even while the Rebbe marched towards him. He did not notice the stares of the people standing on the side of the path. He was totally engrossed in his work. At the last moment he stepped aside and together with the other Hasidim watched the Rebbe pass by with a wide smile on his face. Then Frieden turned to the Hasidim. They were a bit upset with him. With a smile on his face he said to them, "Do you think that I would stand in the Rebbe's way?" Those who saw the look the Rebbe had given Frieden accepted his words and thought to themselves, "What an odd character." Indeed, there is no doubt that Frieden is an odd character. The official photographer to the Rebbe's court is beloved by the Rebbe. He frequently merits special attention. More than once he had been seen in the Rebbe's entourage, his face beaming with delight to have merited to ride in the Rebbe's car. It is no secret that during the journey the Rebbe would converse with him. Stories abound concerning these conversations. One day when Frieden was in an especially good mood, he told the following story. "I'm not trying to show off," he began. "I only want to tell you about the Rebbe's greatness. Once when I was standing at 770, that's 770 Eastern Parkway, the headquarters of Lubavitch, a young man begged me to help him out with a difficult problem. At first I didn't know what he wanted. After all, who was I? I was the Rebbe. He begged and begged, finally convinced me to listen to his tale of woe. This man had been married for 10 years and had not yet merited to have children. He had tried all possible means, but to no avail. He had just about given up hope. When he came to me, he was full of despair. The letters and requests he had sent to the Rebbe had not helped. All gates seemed to be closed to him. As a last attempt, he turned to me. He knew I had a special relationship with the Rebbe. He begged me to speak to the Rebbe on his behalf and obtain a blessing for him. I couldn't stand his tearful look, so full of despair and hopelessness. I understood that he thought I was his last chance. I couldn't bring myself to refuse him. I decided to take advantage of the next opportunity to ask the Rebbe for a blessing on this man's behalf, but that opportunity didn't present itself. Days passed. Finally, the day arrived when I was flying back to Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. I decided that, come what may, I would ask the Rebbe for his blessing. I waited near the Rebbe's home for the moment when the leader of the Jewish people would come out. Suddenly, I became aware that I had been daydreaming. The Rebbe was already halfway to his car. I decided to seize the moment. I held my place and stopped the Rebbe on his way. I only wanted to forward the man's request, but the words stuck in my throat. I was glued to my place. I could see the young man in front of me waiting expectantly, tears streaming down his face. I said, "Rebbe, bless him with children," and quickly told the man's sad story. The Rebbe seemed to be in a very serious mood. He entered the car without saying a word. We continued in silence all the way to 770. Before leaving the car, the Rebbe turned to me and said, "Tell him to give their names and their mother's names to the secretary." I felt relieved. I ran to the young man's house and told him the Rebbe's answer. The joyful expression on his face remains vivid in my mind to this very day. I had no time to observe the outcome. I returned to the land of Israel a few hours later. A year passed, a year of work and toil, and once again the time arrived for my annual visit to the Rebbe for the high holidays of the month of Tishrei. That's the high holidays time. When I walked into the base medrash, the shul, the synagogue at 770, the young man jumped up to greet me, a broad smile on his face. He hugged and kissed me and said with great joy, "How fortunate that you arrived today. You can participate in the bris, the circumcision of my firstborn son." I immediately remembered the whole incident, and my joy was complete. As was my custom, I took my usual place near the Rebbe's house to tell him that I had arrived. When the Rebbe came out of his house, I went up to him and explained emotionally, "The Rebbe, the blessing was fulfilled. They had a son." The Rebbe gave me a fatherly look and waved his hand at me, and as if to say, "Why are you surprised?" But this is another one of these great miracles that the Rebbe can perform and does perform even today. All right, so here's a new story. This great chassid, great Rabbi Michael Dvorkin, of blessed memory, spent the last few years of his life at 770 Eastern Parkway. The previous Rebbe suggested they return to Israel, and Rabbi Dvorkin took this as a sign that his life in this world was coming to an end. For that very reason, he insisted on remaining at 770. He wished to be buried near there. He went to the Rashag, the Rebbe's brother-in-law, and asked him to ask the Rebbe for an extension to be able to remain at 770 longer. The Rashag did as he requested, and the Rebbe agreed that he could remain a little while longer. A short time later, the Rebbe again suggested that Rabbi Dvorkin return to the land of Israel. This time, Rabbi Dvorkin went to the Rebbe's other son-in-law, now as the present Rebbe, and asked him to go to the Rebbe of blessed memory, and asked that he have more time at 770. This request was also granted. Suddenly, on the day before Shavuos, the day of the giving of the Torah, while in the mikveh, the ritualarium, Rabbi Dvorkin fell, and on that very day he returned his soul to his Maker. When they told the Rebbe, his reaction was so emotional that the Rebbetzin thought that his father-in-law, the Rebbe himself, had passed away. The Rebbe instructed me to do everything possible to have the funeral before Yom Tov began. In those days, it was very difficult to arrange a funeral quickly, especially since Rabbi Dvorkin had been in good health. The authorities would insist on examining the body to determine the cause of death. Dr. Zellickson and other doctors who were close to the Rebbe could not be found, nor could any doctor who would issue the necessary death certificates without an autopsy. I tried doctor after doctor until finally one did agree to give me a death certificate on one condition. I want the portion in the world to come of the previous Rebbe's son-in-law, which would be the Rebbe. The Rebbe agreed immediately, but the doctor insisted on having two witnesses certify the arrangement. I called in another young fellow, and the two of us witnessed the Rebbe over the telephone promise his portion in the world to come to that doctor. Only then did the doctor issue the necessary death certificate. The funeral was held that day before Yom Tov, the holiday, began. Rabbi Dvorkin was buried in the Chabad section of the New York cemetery. Later, the Rebbe explained to me why it had been so important that Rabbi Dvorkin be buried to that very day. The Gemara states, the Talmud states, that if someone who dies on the day before Shabbos is buried the same day before Shabbos, it is a good sign for him. For this, the Rebbe explained it was worthwhile sacrificing his entire portion of the world to come, so that Rabbi Michal Dvorkin, who died on the day before Shavuos, could be buried that very day. All right, so things are important. Things seem small in this world, but they're great in maybe more spiritual eyes. During the summer of 1982, this is Rabbi Volpe of the Chabad Institution in Kiryat Gat. My wife and I traveled by car from New York to Toronto to visit a patron of the Chabad institutions in the city of Israel. When we arrived in Elmira, New York, I telephoned the philanthropist, Mr. Zeif, to arrange an appointment for the next day. Over the telephone, I sensed a change in him. His voice had been full of humor, even joy. Now his voice sounded weak and subdued. It seemed that this would not be a normal business appointment. I did not hold back on the telephone. I asked him if anything was wrong and why he sounded so despondent. "Don't ask," he answered. "My wife has been very sick." Mr. Zeif did not elaborate. I did not ask what was wrong with his wife. At the end of our telephone conversation, I apologized for disturbing him at such a trying time and told him that I would postpone our appointment to a later date. But he insisted that I visit him as scheduled. Perhaps I would be able to raise his wife's spirits. When I knocked on the door the next morning, his maid answered and led us into the living room. Mr. Zeif had not arrived yet. The maid went to bring in Mrs. Zeif. Mrs. Zeif looked frail and sick. She was wearing thick, dark eyeglasses. I greeted her and asked how she was feeling. Suddenly she burst into tears and the words came pouring out. I went through an eye operation to remove cataracts. The result was that I lost much of my sight in both eyes. The doctors immediately ordered another operation. The second operation only made my condition worse. For all practical purposes, I am now completely blind. As she was finishing her story, Mr. Zeif walked in with towels and tefillin in his hand. I was amazed that I had been under the impression that Mr. Zeif was not an observant Jew. Mr. Zaif explained that his daughter had become a Balshuva, a returner to Judaism in the land of Israel, where she had attended the Yerushalayim seminary in Jerusalem. She had married a boy from Miracles-2 Yeshiva, and they were now living in Israel. As a result of the change in his daughter's life, he had also begun observing Torah and mitzvot, the commandments. I tried to lift Mr. and Mrs. Zaif's spirits. I suggested they consult eye specialists. Perhaps they could help. Now it was Mr. Zaif's turn to pour out his heart. They had already been to the best eye specialist. They all agreed that his wife's present condition, total blindness, was permanent. I lack nothing, Mr. Zaif moaned, and now our world has become dark. We have lost all desire for life. Look, his wife cried, the high holidays are coming. I won't even be able to recite the prayers. I don't know them by heart. I can't even bench after eating. Oy, death would be better than my life. I felt the depression deeply. I began to speak to them. My dear friends, the Almighty has given our generation the great Rebbe in Lubavitch, who is known as the righteous one of the generation and whose blessings are fulfilled. Let us write a letter to the Rebbe, and I guarantee that happiness will return to your home. Then I told them stories of people who have been saved in the merit of the Rebbe's blessings. My heartfelt words entered their hearts, and the Zaifs decided to write the Rebbe about their problem. We sat down together and composed a letter to the Rebbe, explaining in detail everything that had happened. 2 days later, when my wife and I returned to New York, we brought the letter to the secretary. 2 hours later, we received the following response. The note has been received. Let them consult greater experts. Check their tefillin, the phylacteries, and the mezuzos. Taste the wine of Kiddush on Shabbos, on the Sabbath, and holidays. I will mention it to grave of the previous Rebbe. I immediately contacted Mr. Zaif and related the Rebbe's response. I encouraged him to do everything the Rebbe said and explained that this was the best known remedy to all problems. He promised to carry out the Rebbe's instructions faithfully. When I returned to New York during Hanukkah of 5743, which is like 1983, I called Mr. Zaif to ask how his wife was doing. Mr. Zaif sounded joyful again. As soon as I received the Rebbe's response, he said, my wife and I went for short vacations in the mountains with my mezuzahs in our suitcase. We met a Jew from New York there, and he checked our mezuzahs, only to discover that not one of them was kosher. The Jew from New York sent us new mezuzahs and a new pair of tefillin. When we returned to Toronto, we visited our family doctor, who recommended 2 new specialists. One of them could not meet with us, but the other one, an Italian Gentile, agreed to see us right away. After examining my wife, he told us that there was no established cure for my wife's problem, but he was willing to perform an operation which, if we would pray hard to God, might be successful. Indeed, Mr. Zaif concluded the operation was performed just a few days ago. My wife still has bandages over her eyes, but the doctor is optimistic that she will soon be able to see to some extent, though not very well. The following summer, I traveled to New York again and called on Mr. Zaif. The first thing he told me was, you should know, Rabbi Volpa, that my wife's eyesight has been totally restored. She can drive again and read books. When I heard the news, the words flew out of my mouth. Thank God, what do you say? This is unbelievable. Why are you so shocked? He replied. We fixed our mezuzahs, and every Shabbos and Yom Tov my wife faithfully drinks the Kiddush wine. In addition, she received the Rebbe's blessing. Why is it so strange that her eyes were opened? One miracle after another would keep on rolling. This is from Rabbi Yaakov Leviov. See what he has to say. In those days, I worked in a government dental clinic in a village near the Russian city of Samarkand. One year, I think it was 5728, 1968, instructions arrived for the residents of Samarkand from the Rebbe to hire teachers to teach Torah to the Jewish children of the city. I received these instructions from Rabbi Yosef Ledyov, who now lives in the Chabad community in the city in Israel, Kiryat Malachi. Rabbi Leidioff came to my house to give me the Rebbe's instructions. He suggested that I do my share and accept a group of students. Of course, I agreed immediately. It was clear that the Rebbe's instructions applied to me, as I was loyal and faithful chassid. I did not try to shirk my responsibilities. I made only one condition. Before beginning my new career as a teacher, I would have to resign my job in the clinic. I did not hesitate. The very next day, I went to the director of the clinic and requested that I be relieved of my position. I explained to him that after so many years, it was difficult for me to continue being an effective doctor without taking some supplementary courses. I spiced my words with praise and flattery for him and expressed my tremendous gratitude to him for listening to my request. He told me to return on Friday to pick up the official letter of resignation and receive my final salary. From that moment on, I was a teacher. I went from house to house teaching young Jewish children Torah. I had 4 dedicated children, students whose intense desire to learn motivated me to increase my own knowledge. These were days devoted to Torah and fear of Hashem, the Almighty, and my joy knew no bounds. Another worker was hired to replace me in the clinic. He was also a Jew, but to my great pain, he had left the traditional ways of his ancestors. He was totally non-observant. He worked on the Sabbath and ate all kinds of forbidden foods. The director of the clinic was surprised to find a Jew, and all his outward appearances and actions seemed no different than all the non-Jews he knew. He invited him to his office and expressed his amazement. "Why don't you act like a Jew as your predecessors did?" The Jew was surprised at the question. He decided to prove that he was the enlightened one. He began to say all sorts of things about me. He did not mince his words. He was intent on convincing the non-Jewish director of the clinic that I was nothing less than a revolutionary who was plotting to overthrow the government. He told the director about my desire to go to the land of Israel and how I dreamed of the day I would be granted permission to emigrate. He painted a picture of these Hasidim as a group of extremists who were opposed to the government and did whatever they pleased. He also informed the director that my real motive for resigning my position was to teach children Torah and not to brush up on my medical education, as I had stated. The Russian director was furious. He could not believe that he had been so naive as to trust me, an opponent to the regime for such a long time. Ignorant of all that had transpired, I innocently answered his summons to see me in his office the next Friday. I knocked on the door and entered without awaiting a response, as I was accustomed to do. In the past, the director had always welcomed me warmly. He enjoyed sitting with me and discussing a wide range of topics. This time, however, as soon as I answered, I could see that something was not right. The director looked at me, his face red and his eyes aflame. I had no idea what was going on. "You are a disgusting liar," he screamed at me. "You are nothing more than a traitor who had fooled me all this time. You took unfair advantage of the trust I placed in you." I was shocked and frightened. He quickly stood up and walked towards me. I looked to the side, but he had blocked the way out of his office. I didn't even have a chance to flee. The director could no longer control his rising anger. He grabbed my neck and murmured to himself, "And to think that I allowed this snake to work for me all this time." His anger was growing by the minute. "You won't get away with this," he screamed and began hitting me with all his strength. The whole time I stood there in shock. I didn't know what had happened. I had no idea what he was talking about. But when he started to hit me, I knew I had to act quickly, or he might kill me. I began to shout at the top of my lungs, "Help!" A few seconds later, all the doctors in the building came running into the room. They wrestled the director away from me, but his anger had not subsided. While he was being held down by 2 burly doctors, he shouted, "I don't want to see your face, liar and traitor. I promise that I will do whatever I can to put you in prison where you belong. By Sunday you will feel my true power." I took advantage of the fact that his hands and arms were being held and ran for my life. I arrived home with a heavy heart. I knew that I could no longer count on my resignation letter and my last salary, but this was now the least of my problems. My father of blessed memory saw from the pained look on the face that something terrible had happened. But after hearing my story, he simply calmed me down. You have the Rebbe's blessing. If the Rebbe gave his blessing, nothing bad can possibly result. Don't worry, nothing will happen. Just wait and you will see God's salvation. I can't really say that my father's words soothed me at the time, but it was the best he could do. That Sunday I woke up early to meet with my beloved students. On my way to teach, I had to pass near the director's office. When I reached the street, I glanced towards his office. Everything seemed to be in an uproar. I couldn't understand what all the confusion was about. I slowly drew closer. Suddenly, one of the people standing there recognized me. Everyone now looked up and pointed at me. I was overtaken with surprise. For a moment, I wanted to turn around and run away. Then one of the workers came up to me and cried, "You are a holy man. The director who was making all those problems for you and promised to put you in jail died last night of a sudden heart attack." My father's words had indeed hit the mark. If the Rebbe gave his blessing, nothing bad can possibly result. Well, I think that's, we had a few good 3-4 stories here, and those are beautiful stories. Continue, I know people love stories. Everybody loves a story. It is from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, stories of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And the Rebbe's blessing still comes true, and you know, Jews and non-Jews alike go to the Rebbe for his blessings. They consider a holy man, and like I say, he's not living today, but people go to his gravesite in Queens, and if anybody would like to go there, they can go to the Montefiore Cemetery in Queens. And we there's so many blessings and miracles that do happen in our lives, and we should never forget that. It actually says in the Talmud that even a sword is hanging over your neck. You shouldn't give up hope. And that's truly the case, because certain miracles do happen even at the last moment. In any case, we should only know of good things and blessings and miracles for us also. And thank you very much for watching The Jewish View.